Guys, what's up? Haven't you ever wondered why are there so many fan bases that hate each other? So many of them divided into two factions, as in exactly a JRPG? Well, today we're gonna find out 5 JRPGs that are technically to blame for having torn fan bases apart. Let's begin! First, we have to talk about the tips of the icebergs. On Star Ocean's case, you might think it was the fourth one, the Last Hope, who planted the seeds of discontent among the fans. But in reality, it was the third one. I know it's considered as one of the best by many nowadays, but I clearly remember when it first came out that a lot of people hated it. Be it for the story, or the transition from 2D to 3D, or hell if I know, I was too busy defending it back then. Also, all non-Japanese gamers knew was Star Ocean 2, the second story for the PS1. It wasn't until the PSP games were released, including a remake of the first one for the Super Nintendo, that people reconsidered Star Ocean till the end of time's position. However, first real clashes between fans began during the first years of The Last Hope. Complaints about the story and the characters being generic were, for the most part, the reason behind it. But when Integrity and Faithlessness for the PS4 came out, the fanbase finally exploded into mutual hatred. In my opinion, it was The Last Hope the one to really blame for this, but Star Ocean 5 was the one that made everybody go nuts. Strong criticism against pretty much everything about it corroded the fanbase, since there also came tons of people who did enjoy the game. Characters and story were now even more stereotyped than before, and the battle system was different from all its predecessors. I've only played this game for a couple of hours, so I can't really complain about it. But what I have noticed for the past few years is that there's a huge gap between fans from the first 3 games and the last 2. Hell, some gamers have already started to praise The Last Hope just so they can keep shitting on Integrity and Faithlessness and crown it as the worst Star Ocean ever made to date. This is already surprising you, I know, but let me clarify something first. Persona 5 is a great game, yes, but it didn't tear the Persona fanbase apart, nope, quite the contrary I'd say. What it did tear apart was the Shin Megami Tensei fanbase. It was the first game after the previous 2 entries that didn't include the SMT title anymore. Persona is its own franchise now. It has millions of fans across the world, and even though it did start as a Shin Megami Tensei spin-off with the first Persona games, and even though they still share a lot of similarities gameplay-wise with almost every single title from the franchise, it's really hard to consider them a direct part of it anymore. But leaving that aside, it was only natural that fans from previous games, Persona or Shin Megami Tensei, would feel offended with this game. Why? Simple, because most games from the original franchise had been more adult-oriented with dark, twisted stories and serious intellectual plots. Whereas in Persona, it was just about high school students with special powers. So most anime cliches reigned in, even from the first 2 games, to then temporarily disappear on the third game, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment, only to return heavier and with more presence than ever on Persona 3. But that game was not the tip of the iceberg. Nope, even among Megami Tensei fans it is considered as a great game. All problems really began with Persona 4 and its enormous mainstream success, especially with the golden version for the Vita and the 2 fighting games for the PS3 and the Xbox 360. That game in particular has been exploded in so many ways that I just lost count. Most of the time, dragging Persona 3's cast of characters. But it wasn't until Persona 5 came out that Shin Megami Tensei fans exploded like in a Hollywood action movie. Just like its predecessor, Persona 5 was still full of anime stereotypes, annoying cliches, and a cast of characters not as cheesy as in Persona 4, but cheesy nonetheless. And since the time of Persona 3, the games have been easy entries to the series, being nowhere as near as difficult as most other SMT titles. Fans were angry. I guess Atlus noticed this and intelligently removed the SMT prefix to avoid further problems. Maybe. But anyways, Persona 4 and 5 are really good games, they just don't feel like Shin Megami Tensei titles at all. This one is legendary. There's only 3 games in this franchise, if you could actually call it that way, but only 2 of them were released outside Japan. Everybody's familiar with the allegedly best JRPG of all time, Chrono Trigger. That game has millions of fans worldwide, and it is considered as such by most of its fans. So imagine how they felt after playing Chrono Cross, not only when it came out, but also years afterwards to feel the enormous disappointment. Well, let me tell you what was Trigger's fans' biggest mistake. They thought Cross was a sequel. They wanted a true sequel and not just a spiritual successor. The response was so negative that Masato Kato, writer of both games, had to come out and say that Cross was never meant to be a sequel, that it's its own game. Chrono Cross is my favorite RPG of all time, and I've praised it 1,000 times in this channel. I've always maintained as well that, in my opinion, it is far superior to Trigger in almost every single way. The problem is that that controversial point of view is something that many other fans share. Tons of people prefer Cross 1,000,000 times over Trigger, and since Trigger is considered as the absolute best RPG of all time, then guess how torn apart the fanbase is of this little franchise. I don't hate Trigger. In fact, I like it. It's one of my favorite Super Nintendo RPGs. So I'm fond of both games. I just think the hatred from some Trigger fans towards Cross fans is way out of hand. To prove it, go watch some of the comments on this video I made a while ago. People nowadays keep twisting my words on what I said about Chrono Trigger, proclaiming that I don't like it just because I don't love it. Yup, that's the level of stupidity of some people, and that's why this fanbase is torn apart. At the beginning, Fire Emblem was a niche franchise. Even when the first Game Boy Advance titles came out, it was still not enough for Nintendo to acknowledge it as a successful name. More titles came about and solid fan bases were created outside Japan. People then started playing the old Super Famicom titles until Shadow Dragon, the tip of the iceberg, was released. It was a full remake of the very first Fire Emblem ever made, which came out for the Famicom. It was a great title, yes, but not as good as any others released outside Japan. Mixed reviews and feelings from fans began. The franchise then was ready to die until Nintendo gave it one last shot with Fire Emblem Awakening for the 3DS. All of us know what happened. It literally saved the franchise, but also planted the seeds of destruction within the fanbase. It was another great title, of course. However, it really felt as if it was more oriented to a new market, to a new fanbase other than its original one, with chances of true discord among the fans. Everybody was hoping the next title will fix all of that, but Fates obviously did not. It was a commercial success, but it literally torn the fanbase apart. Most of the old, veteran fans despised it with a passion and began trashing the game at every opportunity possible still doing so nowadays. Tons of fan service, full of cliches and overly stereotyped characters. This three-branch story title brought a lot of new fans to the series, which put a big smile on Nintendo's faces. Today, Fire Emblem is one of the most popular and successful RPG franchises ever. The fans? They hate each other. Me? I like the Fates games, but seriously, I gotta admit, it's among the worst Fire Emblem titles ever made. I just don't hate it, that's all. I saved this for last because it's still nowadays the most infamous of all, legendary for having completely destroyed the Final Fantasy fanbase. What the great mastermind Hironobu Sakaguchi built for over a whole decade before his departure from Squaresoft in 2003, just before the company fused with its rival Enix, vanished overnight. The last game Sakaguchi worked on was Final Fantasy IX, being the producer and the writer. On Final Fantasy X, he was just an executive producer, as well as in Final Fantasy XII. Many will say this game was the tip of the iceberg, including me. Things just began going very wrong from this title onward, and while they tried to save things with Final Fantasy XII, another one that already had the fan base divided, it wasn't until Final Fantasy XIII came out that fans blasted the stage with hatred and insults. From my perspective, Sakaguchi leaving Square and Square owning the franchise's rights was the true tip of the iceberg. Just like with Fire Emblem Fates, Final Fantasy XIII brought millions of new fans to the series, even though having received tons of negative reviews, mainly from original fans of the franchise. However, it was so successful that it spawned 2 more sequels and it became a trilogy. A trilogy that's extremely infamous nowadays, beloved by many and despised by others. Fan service, generic story and characters, and mechanics that were just plain weird, away from the classic turn-based battle system almost all Final Fantasy titles were known for. All this contributed to millions of fans being pissed off, still nowadays shitting on the trilogy whenever possible. I dare to say that this is probably one of the most controversial RPGs in the history of gaming for having torn apart the fanbase of the most popular RPG franchise of all time. Now, these things happen because there's always going to be a difference of opinion among gamers, and it's always been that way and it will always be that way as well. The problem is that there's a lot of gamers out there who cannot seem to be able to respect other people's opinions. So it's up to you whether you want to be that kind of person or not. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time.